The last time Dan had seen Kathi alive, she was sitting behind the wheel of her silver Mustang, turning sharply toward him with an exasperated look. Their quarrel had begun back at Lake Mead when he, tired of her constant taunts and barbs, had first snapped. Too much had accumulated over the years of their marriage, unspoken words, resentments, betrayals. He remembered her last, "I can't take it anymore," her sigh as she slammed the car door shut and sped off, kicking up dust. Dan knew he shouldn't have pursued her that night. He was well aware that they were both overly emotional, but the fear that she might be gone forever was stronger than common sense. He followed her out onto the deserted highway, oblivious to the dangers of the slippery road. What happened next made his life a living hell. Kathi was killed instantly, her car flying off the road and crashing into a huge oak tree that stood on the side of the road like a silent guardian. She never knew that the moment Dan saw the wrecked car, his heart stopped with the realization that he couldn't help her. She was gone and he was left alive, but broken. Every day since her death had been agony. He blamed himself for that fight, for everything he hadn't said or done. Gradually his life became a void, filled only with memories and fear. Strange things began to happen in his house. He heard footsteps when he was home alone, felt a cold touch as if someone was touching his skin. Vague outlines that resembled her silhouette would appear in the mirror for a moment. He couldn't tell if it was his grief-stricken mind or something darker that now lived near him. It's been a year since the night Kathi died. Today, on the anniversary of her death, Dan drove out to Desert Highway 375 again to complete something he'd long put off. His decision was desperate, but it was the only one he had to get it over with. The highway stretched out in front of him like an endless black snake slipping away into the night horizon. He drove at full speed, both hands on the wheel, his fingers white with tension. Driving through the desert, his gaze never left the rearview mirror. It seemed as if someone was watching him, breathing down his back, waiting. "Strange, no cars, not a single one," he muttered, checking the mirror. It was implausible, even at night, someone had to be driving down this road. But ahead all was quiet, and behind him there was only emptiness. As if on cue, headlights flashed behind him. Dan tensed, sharply shifted his gaze to the mirror. The bright spots of light were fast approaching, but he couldn't see the car or the other driver. The headlights flickered, blinding, and then disappeared. The sky was dark again, and the desert was completely silent. "It's just an illusion," he whispered to himself, but something inside already knew the truth. Something was wrong here. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the silence. There was a hissing sound outside the window, like someone in the darkness slowly exhaling. Dan froze, his heart beating faster. The sound repeated, but this time it was higher, painfully familiar. A woman's voice, quiet, haggard, like her voice had once been. "You're too late, Dan," the voice whispered in his ears like a whisper of wind. He jerked up, looking sharply at the passenger seat, but no one was there. "No. That's impossible. You're dead." His voice was full of terror. His hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached, and his breathing became frequent and ragged. The sound of footsteps. They came slowly, rumbling, with some strange, ragged breathing. Dan looked frantically in the rearview mirror. A blurred figure in the dust was approaching the car, unhurried but with an intimidating certainty. Her outline was indistinct, like a ghost barely discernible in the semi-darkness. But it was her silhouette. "No." He wheezed, gripping the steering wheel, and her voice, quiet and agonizing, continued to echo in his head, "You left me." He tried to turn on the headlights, start the engine, but the car wouldn't respond. His hands trembled, his fingers slid over the buttons, but all to no avail. Darkness thickened around him like a heavy blanket. And in that deafening, overwhelming silence, he felt someone behind him gently touch his neck. Fingers cold as ice slowly slid up the back of his neck, and terror paralyzed him. "I'll never leave, Dan," she whispers, and he feels something pulling him into the darkness, into the depths of her voice, into that world where everything he feared comes to life. In that instant, everything in front of his eyes turns upside down. He sees again that fateful moment when her car flew off the road. He tries to scream, to run, but he can't move. Katie's car approaches the tree, and he realizes that nothing has changed. It was a foregone conclusion. But in that moment, something changes. Time slows down, and instead of watching the inevitable collapse, he hears her voice again. But now it's not asking him for help, she's offering him a choice. You can walk away, Dan. Let me go and live. Or stay here with me, forever. He froze, his mind whirling with memories of her smile, of her laugh, of their evenings together. But along with that came bitterness and pain and thoughts of how they'd never had time to forgive each other. Forever? He whispered back, voice trembling. Yes, she answered, and her voice was full of a strange tenderness. At that moment, a fork in the road appeared before him. He could either let go of the past, choosing life, or he could sink into this dark, endless desert where her shadow would be with him forever. But if I leave, who are you then? He asked, already knowing the answer. I am you, Dan. You are me, the shadow replied, and her voice sounded as if all his fears and regrets were speaking to him. At first light, as the desert came alive again, a few passing hikers spotted Dan's car. It was parked in the middle of the road, the engine still running, and the door was open. No sign of the driver was found. Inside on the passenger seat was an old photograph of his wife, but there was a strange smile on her face. People like that can't be found, whispered an old local, standing in the shadows, looking at the car. They get lost in their own memories. The sun was rising above the horizon, illuminating the endless desert.